Early observations. So, with a few exceptions, Earth's surface appears to remain unchanged. Like you don't go outside and expect to see a chasm in your front yard or a mountain there that wasn't there before. Some exceptions to this include things like earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, floods, etc. So there may be some exceptions to that. But for the most part, things don't change that quickly or that often, at least on a human time scale. However, the surface has changed dramatically on a geologic time scale. So if we look at a geological time scale, it's changed a lot. In the late 1500s, Abraham Ortelius noticed that continents on either side of the Atlantic seemed to fit together. He proposed that North America and South America had been separated from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods. So this we talked about Alfred Wegener earlier and him looking at this later on, but this was actually something that's been around for a long time, ever since really 100 years or so after the Americas were discovered. Map makers started noticing that these look like they fit together. But then over the next 300 years, the 1500s to 1800s, many scientists and writers noticed and commented on these matching coastlines. This is just some early maps. This is actually from 1858, showing basically what they had mapped the Earth out to look like after the New World was discovered. So you have South America over here, you've got Africa over here, and it's kind of just showing what would happen if you took South America and just kind of moved it into place right here. So if you took South America and just kind of pushed it over, you get something that looks a lot like the map on the left here. Alfred Wegener was a German meteorologist who also studied geology, geophysics, and geography. So he studied a few different things there. In 1912, Wegener presented his ideas about continental movement to the scientific community. Now, this was the first time that the idea of moving continents was proposed as a scientific hypothesis. So before this time, a lot of people noticed it, they commented on it, they said things about it. It's like, gee whiz, that looks like it goes together, like South America and Africa, for example. But nobody else had really proposed a serious scientific hypothesis until Wegener came along in 1912. He was also the first person to look at more than just the apparent fit of the continents. Before this, a lot of people just looked at the maps and said, oh, they look like they go together. But Wegener had more evidence, so we'll talk about in a minute. This was first published as The Origins of Continents and Oceans in 1915. So it kind of presented this at a meeting somewhere in 1912, and then a book was published in 1915, again called The Origins of Continents and Oceans. So continental drift. So Wegener's hypothesis was called continental drift. Continental drift proposed that Earth's continents had once been joined as a single landmass that then broke apart and sent the continents adrift. So it was all one landmass that then broke up, and that was the idea of continental drift. Wegener called this supercontinent Pangaea, and this comes from the Greek, and it means all the Earth. So Pan for all, Gaia refers to the Earth, so Pangaea refers to all of the Earth. Suggested that it began to break apart about 200 million years ago. We'll abbreviate that MYA throughout the rest of this. But 200 million years ago, because that's a lot of the fossil evidence kind of led him to believe that that's about the time frame when this broke up. But after it broke up, the continents slowly drifted to their present-day positions. Wegener, again, was the first to base his idea on more than just the shapes of continents. And I'll go ahead and say it now. Most of what he based this on was fossil evidence. So fossil evidence. So this is just a model showing continental drift. So if we go back 200 million years ago, all the continents were assembled in a single landmass that Wegener called Pangaea. Go forward about 20 million years. Continental rifting breaks Pangaea into several land masses, and then the North Atlantic starts to form. The North Atlantic is starting to form right there. We go 135 million years ago. Africa and South America begin to separate. So South America is right here, Africa is right here. They're going to start separating. 65 million years ago, India starts to move north toward Asia. So this is India right here. It's moving north towards Asia. Present day India collides with Asia to form the Himalayas, and Australia is separated from Antarctica. Then a rift valley is forming in East Africa, which is basically where Madagascar came from. Madagascar is right here. There was a rift valley, and Madagascar broke off. There's actually going to be another new island between Africa and Madagascar once it breaks off. But the continents continue to move over Earth's surface. I guess I should point out Australia is basically right here. Antarctica is down here. If we go back to this one, Australia is there. Antarctica is there. South America, Africa, North America is here, and then Asia is right here. And then we said that this one was India. So evidence from rock formations. So Wegener reasoned that large geologic structures like mountain ranges would have separated when Pangaea broke up. So he thought then there should be similar rock types and similar mountain ranges and mountain types on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So using this reasoning, Wegener found identical layers of rocks in the Appalachian Mountains and mountains in Greenland, mountains in Europe, also mountains in Ireland, etc. These layers were more than 200 million years old, indicating that they were joined together more than 200 million years ago, which again, we think Pangaea split up around 200 million years ago. So that does match the timing for when we think Pangaea split up. So this is a map showing some similar fossils and rocks, kind of looking at the rocks right now. The blue on our map here on the left shows similar rock types. So we got similar rock types here in North America, Greenland, parts of Canada, Europe, etc. So you got similar rock types there. You got similar rock types in South America and Africa. More importantly, you got matching mountain ranges. So if you look at right here, we got the Appalachian Mountains. We also have a matching mountain range up here in northern Europe. And if we zoom in here, you can actually see that that same mountain range is also right here in the northern UK, which would be kind of Ireland, Scotland area. Then if we look at our other map over here, we've got, basically this is focusing just on the mountains. So you got the Appalachian Mountains right here along the east coast of the U.S. This range kind of continues on up into Greenland, but also continues into the British Isles, so Scotland, Ireland, northern UK. And then you got the Caledonia Mountains, which is sort of the same mountains we were looking at in northern Europe on the other map over here. Also, this mountain range is sort of on the west coast of Africa here too. So this mountain range was once connected together before it split up. So evidence from fossils. So Wegener found similar fossils of several different plants and animals that lived on or near land on widely separated continents. And this is kind of important that these lived on or near land, because if they're marine organisms, they could just swim over there. But since these live on or near land, they would have to swim across the ocean, which would not likely happen. So land-dwelling animals, such as Cynonathus and Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus, we got a fossil down here. But these really couldn't have swum between the continents because they're land-dwelling animals. They're not going to swim across the ocean necessarily. And even if one managed to, there wouldn't be enough to have an actual breeding population so that you would have a large quantity of fossils on both those continents. Fossils of Mesosaurus, which is an aquatic reptile, have been found in freshwater rocks. So it's unlikely to have survived the trip in saltwater, because if the fossils are in freshwater rocks, it was probably a freshwater aquatic reptile. All the fossils that Wegener looked at were older than 200 million years. Again, there's our timeline. Again, that's the time frame for when Pangea broke up. It was 200 million years ago. So these all match that same timeline. So climatic evidence. So plants only grow in certain climates. So plant fossils are good indicators of past climates. That's actually how we originally started defining climates, was looking at what group of plants grew in an area, and then you could decide what the climate was. So if you had a bunch of cacti, for example, it's a desert. If you have a bunch of tropical plants, it's tropical. If you have a bunch of evergreen type plants, it's probably going to be tundra, taiga kind of area, etc. But anyway, so the type of plant would define the climate. But one plant fossil that Wegener used was Glossopteris, which is a little seed fern that resembles low shrubs. Found fossils of this in South America, Antarctica, and India. And those three places are very different. South America is, climate speaking wise, it's very tropical usually, depending on where you're at, I guess. But Antarctica, very cold, ice sheets, etc. India, kind of hot and dry. So those areas wouldn't have all been the same. They wouldn't have all had the same plants. So those locations also too big to cover one climate. So it's too big of an area to have been one climate. Also, Glossopteris grows in temperate climates. So these areas or these locations had to be closer to the equator at one time, or possibly further away from the equator. India is hot and dry. It'd have to be further away from the equator really to be temperate. So in other words, all these had to be in some temperate area at some point in time. Right now, none of those three are temperate. So those rocks basically had to be joined at one point in time for those fossils to all be there. So. Okay, so this is a map of similar fossils and rocks again. We saw this earlier and looked at the rocks and the matching mountain ranges. What we're kind of look at now is the different fossils that we have. So we'll kind of zoom in on it a little bit here. If we look at the Sinanathus fossils, so this red fossil here. So erase these others real quick here. So we look at the Sinanathus fossil. It's the red one. And it's actually right here in South America, and it's right here in Africa on the coast here. And not only does it occur on both continents, on South America and Africa, but these actually are even aligned so that if you drew a line between these two or you reconnected these continents, they would connect. So not only are they on both continents, but they line up so that they would connect together if you push these continents back together. Glossopteris again. We have Glossopteris here in South America. We got Glossopteris here in Africa. And again, these would kind of line up if you connected them. Glossopteris also is found here in Antarctica. We've kind of got some lines already drawn in here. That would connect to the fossils found in Australia. So again, these where these are outlined, that's kind of where the fossils have been found. So you're kind of talking about the range of these fossils. So that Glossopteris also would have been found in Africa there as well. Mesosaurus was another one. So Mesosaurus is the yellow. It's kind of hard to see. I kind of covered it up here, but let's erase some of this here. So if we erase some of that, let's erase all that. So if you look at the Mesosaurus, it's right here in the yellow in South America, which also kind of lines up with where it's at in Africa on the southern tip. There's also this little spot here in Antarctica where we found Mesosaurus fossils. So those all start to line up as well. So coal deposits. So sedimentary rocks provide clues to past environments. Why? Because that's also where fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. But Wegener found evidence that climates of some continents have changed. Again, looking at plant fossils, also looking at coal deposits. Coal deposits have been found in Antarctica and then other high latitude areas. High latitude areas referring to areas that are closer to the poles. So like maybe 60 degrees north or south onto the poles. So 60 degrees up to like maybe 90 degrees. That's high latitude areas. That'd be north and south. In this case, talking about south because we're talking about Antarctica. But coal forms from the remains of ancient swamp plants that grow in warm, wet regions. Well, Antarctica is not a warm, wet region, but there are coal beds in Antarctica. So those coal beds indicate that Antarctica was at one point in time tropical or at least subtropical, had areas that were warm, wet, lots of swamps, lots of plants, lots of vegetation to have these coal deposits form there. So Wegener concluded that Antarctica must have been much closer to the equator at some point in its geologic past. And then you've got a picture here of the coal seams, and actually that is a person standing right there. My color schemes are not all that great, but that is a person standing right there. So that is a rather thick coal seam there. And glacial deposits. So glacial deposits are found in parts of Africa, India, Australia, and South America, areas we don't typically think of as cold and covered by glaciers. These deposits are about 290 million years old, which kind of means that they could have been around the time of Pangea, since we think it broke up around 200 million years ago. But that suggests that these areas were once covered by a thick ice sheet. Okay. And kind of if you look at the diagram here, kind of shows that if we had Antarctica pretty close to the South Pole, and then you had Africa, South America, India, Australia kind of clustered around it, then those ice sheets could kind of spread out to all of those continents. But since this area is too warm for ice sheets to develop now, they were likely near the South Pole at some point in time. Again, Africa and India, we don't think about, or Australia, we don't think about these as cold areas where you would have, glaciers. But either the South Pole moved, like the Earth tipped on its axis or something like that, or the land masses moved. And Wegener argued that it was more likely that the land masses moved as opposed to the Earth's axis changing. Okay. So a rejected notion. So in the early 1900s, most people in the scientific community believed that continents and ocean basins were fixed features. In other words, they've always been where they are. They don't move. They haven't changed. They just have always been there and always been the same. So a lot of people rejected his idea because of that. So Wegener continued his polar expeditions and collected more data. And although he did have an impressive amount of data, his continental drift hypothesis was not accepted in his lifetime. In fact, he actually ended up dying in 1930 in Greenland on one of his expeditions to collect fossil evidence, etc. So flaws in the continental drift hypothesis. So there are two major flaws in the continental drift hypothesis, and they kind of go together. But first, it did not explain what force could be strong enough to push or pull or move such large masses over great distances. Wegener kind of suggested that it was Earth's rotation, and some sort of centripetal force or something like that was causing them to move. But physicists basically showed that there was not nearly enough force from the Earth's rotation to cause this to happen. Second, scientists questioned how the continents were moving. So what mechanism was making this happen? So where was the force coming from? What was the mechanism? Again, this kind of go together, but Wegener proposed that the continents were simply plowing through a stationary ocean floor, like the ocean floor was just stationary and then these continents were just kind of plowing through it. But it was known in quotes, that the mantle below the crust was solid, which we now know it's not. It's actually partially molten, kind of plasticky kind of texture to it. But at the time, they thought that the mantle was solid, the crust was solid, so how could these continents move through something solid? So again, those were two of the flaws in the continental drift hypothesis. So reconsidering continental drift, so in the early 1960s, new technology revealed new evidence about how the continents move. This came through advances in seafloor mapping, so we got better maps of the seafloor, also a better understanding of Earth's magnetic field, and evidence that we got from magnetic field changes in the rocks and stuff like that. But this provided evidence of how the continents move and the source of the forces involved. And scientists began to reconsider Wegener's idea of continental drift at this point. So with these extra advances in, again, seafloor mapping, a better understanding of Earth's magnetic field, his hypothesis was revisited